Great, then thank you very much again, Kiho, and everybody for participating here. We've got a fabulous panel here. We're going to do similar to what has been occurring throughout this session, 8 minutes, please, by the panelists. We're going to save questions for the end. And what I would like to do here, we've got essentially 3 different groups here represented here in the panelists. We have some of the organizational procedural experts, and we're very pleased to have the current chair of Working Group 3, René, here, and then Phil, who previously had this responsibility for Working Group 2 before the start of the current process. We have 2 academics who will be looking at this from a outsider perspective, but an informed outsider perspective. So very pleased with Machiel and Osamu for your presence here. And of course, we have Lisa and Claire, who are more on the operational and engagement side on different aspects related to tourism. So without further ado here, we're going to start the timer here. And I would like René, please, to lead us off with keeping in mind, as the chair of the group here, you're more neutral on the substance, but the process is fascinating. So please, René.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm looking forward to this panel. I hope I get some new ideas from the panel and from the audience, obviously. And happy to kick it off. Talked about the process yesterday at quite some length already. So let's look at what we're doing. And so there was a decision adopted in 2023 to develop a comprehensive and consistent regulatory framework for Antarctic tourism. And then in 2024, when I became the chair of the special working group that was established, we adopted a decision containing 6 building blocks, mentioned those already yesterday. And if you unpack the building blocks, then you find 46 topics. And it was and is a daunting prospect to address all those topics. Some are easier than others, I think. Some are actually extremely complicated. So we have as the first building block managing growth, and we all have seen the numbers, thanks to IATTO, that we have hit the 100,000 visitors mark, and the growth has been and continues to be exponentially, even though it seems to be slowing down now, but I think over the longer term perspective is that it is still growing. What we have also seen is that the types of tourism are diversifying. People want to go where other people have not been. People want to conduct activities that other people have not done, or at least not done in Antarctica. And I'm still lost count as to the number of marathons that take place in Antarctica, but it is more than one. And there are a couple. I said, why would you do that to yourself? But people are doing it. And of course, you know, looking at a marathon that's 42 kilometers, many opportunities, and in particular, because that is, of course, a very intense activity that will have some environmental impacts, and it will be also not so easy to clean it up. But I understand that your organizers are doing it pretty well. But then we have monitoring that has been considered very important. That how can we assess the impacts of tourism and other non-governmental activities in Antarctica? So we have to collect and manage data, and then of course who can access the data, how is the data to be used, and what lessons then are we learning from that, and how do we proceed with those lessons? The fourth building block relates to compliance and enforcement. So we have many visitors making use of members of IATTO, and IATTO has been very effective in imposing regulations that have also been adopted by the ATCM. But how do you impose the regulations on non-IATTO operators? How do you impose it on the small yachts that are not affiliated with IATTO? And then, the bigger question even is, how are you going to impose those regulations on operators licensed by non-state parties? So compliance and enforcement is an issue. Someone even mentioned the idea of a compliance committee, which is something that you can find under many multilateral environmental treaties. The fifth building block relates to the governance. Let's say, acknowledge that the leading role should be the ATCM, irrespective, I think, whether there's going to be a new treaty or not, and that the advice should be coming from the CEP, but it will be an important role for the national competent authorities as well, and this also includes the discussion on fees. And I think there was in Hiroshima an agreement in principle to establish a fee system. I think there was one country still holding out on that, not because they were opposed to fees, but because, as I understand it, they're afraid that if they say yes to fees, and that would be a relatively low-hanging fruit, and then if we would grab that fruit, then nothing will come of all the other issues that are on the table. And then we have a long list of general topics, including how the framework is going to relate to existing regulations, resolutions, measures, in particular, of which there are dozens. And also it lists some of the important principles and precaution is mentioned there. The primacy of scientific research also is mentioned there. Adaptive governance, it was mentioned earlier today, also when providing for, adopting this framework, then realizing that it should evolve in the future, depending on the growth and diversification of tourism. So those are the 6 building blocks, 46 issues, 2 minutes, I'm going to make it. The underlying question is whether there should be a paradigm shift or not. And so I would like to hear from the panelists, should there be a paradigm shift, and what would that look like? And if that's not the case, what would then be the added value of a regulatory framework? So, and with that, I give it back to you, Bill.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And bonus points for keeping it within our time frame here. So you mentioned in point number 6, or building block number 6, governance of the existing resolutions and activities that the ATCM has taken in the past on tourism. With that as an introduction, let me turn this over to Phil for a little bit on the historical aspect and what is this brand new tourism, or has this been discussed for a while? Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. So I think, just to jump back a little bit to the question in the agenda for the discussion, I think I can say that from my perspective, the question is, are we closer to a comprehensive regulatory framework? And I would say, I think yes, we are. There's a lot of discussion to come, but we are moving forward, and that's really important and really heartening. So yes, the background. Most people are aware that tourism has been occurring for a very long time in Antarctica, and that it has grown in scale over a couple of decades to the level at which it occurs now. And then across that same time period, the parties have been discussing tourism issues of various sorts and in varying levels of detail. Some of that discussion I had the privilege of chairing inside the ATCM as a co-chair of Working Group 2, including the point where we took the decision in 2023 to embark on the development of a framework. More broadly, I've been involved in the tourism discussions as an Australian representative for many years. So that's, I guess, the first point is much of this has been discussed and on the table for a really long time, but we're now at a point where we're needing to tease out the different positions and the different views and find what we can get agreement on. It's probably also worth just noting that there's a fundamental regulation already in place for all activities in Antarctica through the protocol. So tourism is not operating in some sort of regulatory vacuum. There's a really high standard required of all activities occurring in Antarctica for consistency with the principles of the protocol and environmental impact assessment. And so tourism is administered and scrutinised by national governments in their implementation of the protocol through their national legislative arrangements. And then for some parties, they are able to bring additional things to the management of their own tour operators and organisers, and that's an important point. The current arrangements are that if you're a tour operator from country X will apply the provisions of the protocol to your planned activity and possibly additional requirements according to that country's own view. And that is one potential area where we see divergences in approach from different countries. And then there are some other potential divergences of approach that come through administrative practice in different countries. And you will see in the record of discussions that one of the concerns is how to harmonise and ensure a level playing field and the same type of regulation being applied across different countries to the tourism activities that they authorise. In addition to the fundamental regulation that comes through the protocol, we have some very specific tourism-focused measures in place. One is Measure 4 2004, which relates to safety and contingency planning for tourism and non-governmental activities. And then there's Measure 15 2009, which was adopted to regulate a number of aspects of the conduct of tourism activities, including landing of passengers from vessels, with regulation of numbers and one ship at one time at a landing site, etc. Now, those measures are agreed, but they are not in force internationally, and that's a problem. And one of the questions for, I think, many parties is we're partway through the discussion of a framework. If it includes legally binding measures, will they suffer the same fate of not entering force for a really long time because of inertia or because it takes a long time to get things on the legislative agenda in different countries? So that's something that underlies this. So we agreed to the development of the framework, and there's a high level of goodwill and high levels of participation from that point forward, and I think that's very positive in a sort of in a world where there can be contestation of ideas. And I think one of the key tricks will be maintaining that goodwill as we walk through process, and particularly when we step into the more difficult discussions of what will and won't be able to gain support. I'll note that, and I'll just say there that I'm I guess a pragmatic optimist. Possibly some would say that I'm simplistic, but I think the framework really needs to be able to be implemented, and it has to be in addition to an overarching governance structure, it has to be a practical and functional and implementable set of arrangements. And they span the domestic and the international, which is challenging. So, as René explained, we're really starting to develop and narrow in on what's required for different parts of the framework. For me, some of the key elements that we're seeing play out in those discussions are views about national approaches versus a role for collective action through the ATCM or other organs. Questions about hard legal approaches and what role other tools may play. I think there's still a discussion on one hand that's quite philosophical and idealised, and on the other hand that is interested in the very practical implementation questions, because we're talking about governing a real activity that has to happen in certain ways, and how do we do those things. And there's a little bit of to and fro about comprehensive or stepwise. And in some cases, I think we have some parties who want both, in a way, and I think we're all committed to a comprehensive framework, but some people are continuing to put forward things that they think are more urgent than the comprehensive framework timeline. So there's some of the broader binaries. Well, that's again simplistic, but there's some of the broader kind of underpinning considerations that are still playing out. I think that's probably enough. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Phil, and really appreciate that touching on low-hanging fruits, comprehensive versus stepwise. This is some of the negotiating process. And as you mentioned, this has been going on for a while here, and I know, Claire, from some of your previous interventions here, you discussed about moving from, oh, hush, he did fine. Moving from discussion to action here. So let me turn this over to you, Claire, please.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Yes, I think there was a discussion about, or the title of the session is, are we getting closer to a framework? So from my perspective, and I guess my perspective as a member of an environmental NGO or somebody who represents an environmental NGO, although these are my own thoughts, not ASOC's, I think there were definitely some clear positives to this year's discussion. As was mentioned, I think everyone is still participating in the discussions largely constructively, which is not something I would say for many of the discussions that we had at the CEP and ATCM. So while at times I think the Working Group 3 discussions are often quite complicated and maybe sometimes a little bit circular, we're not seeing the kind of unreasonable blocking we might see on other issues, or maybe not unreasonable is not the right word, blocking without kind of any way to progress forward. I think there are countries that have differences of opinion, but these are generally presented as not as barriers to further discussion or barriers to continuing to work towards an outcome. I think the fact that, as René mentioned, there was a pretty good convergence on the need for fees. I think that was a strong positive, and while that is one element out of many in a larger framework, I think those are going to be essential to the success of any framework. Parties do not have infinite resources to spend on monitoring. The Antarctic Treaty Secretariat does not have resources to spend on monitoring. And I think just as a general principle, visitors to ecologically important sites all over the world typically pay fees. And I think that it's important to convey to visitors that this is an ecologically important site. And I think I'm stealing this idea from an intervention during the session, so apologies, but that actually paying a fee makes visitors aware that Antarctica is important enough, is important. I think also something that's important to note about fees is that I recall several years ago when fees were discussed, many parties said, absolutely not, we don't like that. So the fact that there is convergence on it now, I think shows that people are evolving their thinking, which is always good when you're trying to get to consensus. I think there's a lot of openness to different approaches, including, I think, from my perspective, more regional spatial management, more systematic approaches. For those who aren't necessarily familiar with the system, there's a lot of focus right now on sites and guidelines for visitors at specific sites, which I think is very useful. But in terms of conserving the area where tourists go, which is the Antarctic Peninsula, I think you want the sum to be great, the whole effect of tourism regulation to ensure that the whole area is protected. And can you do that if you're only looking at sites individually versus what are the objectives you want to achieve for the broader area in terms of environmental protection? So I think looking at spatial management approaches is very important. So the fact that there's discussion of that is good. In terms of some of the not so positive, I think the fact that some countries are not fully able to engage intercessionally, and this is not necessarily a criticism, some of them just don't have the resources. I think that's unfortunate because I think for something this complex, the intersessional discussions are really key. I think some countries tend to often focus a lot on process, how do we do this? What's the proper step? I'm thinking in particular, there was a lot of discussion about how Working Group 3 could ask the CEP for advice on how to do tourism monitoring. And while I agree it's important to follow clear processes, I think sometimes maybe you could just be a little more practical and just get it done rather than worrying too much about the exact right order of things. I think something maybe that's not necessarily positive or negative is, I think, something that was mentioned before. How do you manage the balance, the specific and general? For example, I think fees are a good example. It's very specific, but it's crucial to the overall success of the framework, I think. And there's also been some discussion about how form should follow function. So you need to decide on the function of the framework before you decide on the form. But I think also that's maybe not a unidirectional process. I think in some ways, doing something that might be administratively complicated, like a fee, will inform what function the framework is able to have. So that's probably not necessarily a helpful observation in terms of moving forward, but it's just something I think is part of the discussion. But I think one other comment on general versus specific is that it's a lot easier for people to wrap their minds around specific incidents or specific ideas, and maybe that can help with the overall, what needs to be in the overall framework. And not to brag too much about ASOC specifically, but one paper we put forward about the development of deep field tourism and air cruise tourism mentioned a specific project that is being envisioned by a non-governmental operator. And that mentioning of that in that paper sparked actually quite a lot of discussion, and it resulted in some parties saying they wanted to develop a measure to address or to prevent the possibility of non-governmental operators from developing their own infrastructure that is not affiliated with any specific country. So I think sometimes, that would be more general measure that's sparked by a specific incident. So sometimes it's hard for people to think abstractly. So maybe sometimes these individual things can lead to a broader thinking about how they want to do things. One final point I'd mention is that there was a lot of discussion about, as was mentioned before, the tension between what national authorities should do versus what the framework should be telling everyone to do. And I think really it is, you do need to emphasize that the level playing field is important. And I think what we currently see with the implementation of environmental impact assessments, which I think is a good parallel example, there are guidelines for that. And there are guidelines being discussed within the context of the framework, guidelines for how parties might interpret certain things under the framework. And what we see with EIA guidelines is that the guidelines can be very clear, but parties can implement them very, very differently. And there's a very wide range. If you look at EIA documents, there's a very wide range in how they're done by different parties. So if you do want to create a level playing field for operators and therefore not incentivize operators who might not want to do things the right way, I think you do need to, I think some parties may need to really think about what they might be willing to give up in exchange for a little bit more consistency in application. So yeah, that's about it. I think we're making progress slowly, but that's the nature of the system. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Claire. And next up is going to be Lisa here. We've talked a little bit about different standards, level playing field. IATTO represents a coalition of competitors, more or less. But be very interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. And in the terms that we've been using for the last 2 weeks, as it's the first time I'm taking the mic, I'd like to thank Akio for the invitation, and to all our hosts in Japan. It's been absolutely wonderful, and thanks to all the presenters. I think that sessions like these, especially where it's a little bit more informal, leads to really great opportunities for brainstorming and collaboration. So thank you. As Bill mentioned, I am with the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, or IATTO. And of course, in a session like this, and certainly in Working Group 3, there's a lot on tourism I could cover. I think that most of you in the room are probably familiar with IATTO, but for those who are online, you may not be. So I thought that it might be helpful to have a quick intro and particularly give a sense on how IATTO is interacting with the framework discussions and how we contribute to those discussions, both at ATCM and during the intersessional period. As Bill just mentioned, we are a trade organization. We have over 120 international members, including 51 operators, and those are the folks who are receiving the permit or authorization from a national competent authority. Our operators make up approximately 98% of all tourism visitation to Antarctica, including yachts, all of the Solus vessels, and all of the deep field operators at this time. The missing 2% consists of non-IATTO yachts, and those may be permitted or not. It just depends. And this last season, for those who haven't read our paper from ATCM quite yet, there were approximately 113,000 visitors with IATTO operators. I think it's really important to make the distinction that IATTO does not promote tourism. We do want to make it sure that it is done properly if that peaceful activity is happening. And we do know that, through tourism research that has been going on since the 1990s during that first period of growth, that 100 people, following Measure 15, 2009, that 100 people managed well on shore can have very little impact. But a small group, or even just an individual misbehaving, can have really lasting consequences. And so our operators are really dedicated to making sure it's done properly. Our operators are stewards of Antarctica. That's laid out in our strategic plan. And the operators collectively develop, adopt, and implement the policies and operational procedures to further our mission of safe and environmentally responsible tourism. Additionally, IATTO, under our bylaws, we implement all of the ATCM instruments, whether they are ratified or not, which hopefully is at this particular time of help to treaty parties who don't have everything ratified in their own legislations. We support the development of this framework and think that there's, we're all united in the goal of protecting Antarctica and creating that level playing field. We're hearing about a level playing field, and that is important. Not having a level playing field can lead to confusion, can lead to forum shopping, and there are different ways that operators will do that. And in some cases, they'll go and get their vessel flagged to a non-treaty state, so they don't necessarily have to fall underneath the treaty guidance. We do believe that the framework can be a collaborative approach. There are ways that we as industry can help the treaty parties, and also where we as industry we do need help. And going to Sanjay's point earlier, the interplay of that public and private is really important, especially when we're looking at the overarching governance and then the actual practical day-to-day management in the field. We're pretty proud of the way that we self-manage and the way that has evolved over the last 35 years of IATTO existence while working with the regulators and continually adapting the guidance and best practices to meet needs and challenges informed by best available science and then also operational knowledge. We continue to invest in those resources that are needed for implementing more of these regulations and guidance, but we want to be able to feed into the conversations and the development of that greater overarching umbrella of guidance that comes from the treaty, of those regulations that will create that level playing field. So we feed into that. We try to feed into it as much as possible through data, through sharing our own monitoring efforts, our site stewardship program, and also to be as transparent as we possibly can with our data and operational practices. The operators do want to protect Antarctica, and it's one of the many reasons they signed up for IATTO. But as we talked about data-driven science, well, I know that sometimes that can be used as, in some views, as kind of a cop-out that you don't have to follow it. 2 minutes, great, no problem. We do need that information to bring the operators along, but that doesn't mean that that we can't be precautionary. And in fact, we have been precautionary in our approaches, certainly creating more site guidelines, as well as our approaches towards the HPAI. I know that there's always the question of why can't we put a cap on the numbers or vessels, and we can't do that because we are a trade organization. We can ban activities that don't fall within our mission, which is safe and environmentally responsible, and we've done so with surfing and any kite-enabled activity. But for those bigger regulations, we do need that help from the Antarctic treaty parties. Final plug for those of you who haven't gotten to it yet, if you want to read IP 198, which this talks about the existing functions, how we work into existing functions to uphold the Antarctic Treaty instruments and protections, as well as outlining opportunities and challenges, which from our viewpoint will help to strengthen the management of Antarctic tourism. Happy to take any questions.
Howdy there. Thank you very much for that. That's a super useful oversight here. And so with this, we're going to turn it over to the academics here. And I'm going to start off here with Machiel. I'd like to get your perspective on any aspect of this really huge activity here. Oh, be quiet here. We have over 100,000 people that are showing up for a very short time, plus all the staff and crew. But we have it's an even broader aspect of that. You've got the industry behind all of that, and then you've got the regulations. I'd be very curious about your perspective. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Bill. And yeah, I would like to say first, also give my gratitude to Akio and his team for inviting us here. It's really a pleasure. Maybe first, very quickly introducing myself. My name is Machiel Lamers. I'm a professor in environmental sociology, with a focus on sustainable tourism. Let's say climate relations and nature conservation. And I have worked on Antarctic tourism for quite a long time. I did my PhD actually on it between 2004 and 2009, which was really in a previous, let's say, phase of a great increase at that time. I have been part of the Dutch delegation of the Antarctic Treaty, so this year and last year, as an observer, advisor. And that's really much in the context of a number of large Antarctic tourism research projects that are taking place. So to already come to your question, for this activity that is now, let's say, around 120,000 tourists, we are not only developing an international framework, but there's also, let's say quite a lot of research taking place in the Netherlands only in the last couple of years, and in the coming years of around 6 million euros. So 6 projects. I'm leading 2 of them. Let's say one is called Antarctic. It's really about understanding environmental stewardship in different social and institutional contexts around Antarctic tourism. That includes also self-regulation, but also a gateway, also a gateway cities and ports. State, let's say, intergovernmental activities, but also science, tourism, interrelations in the context of tourism development. And the second one that is called TransAct, that is really about translating, let's say, these research outcomes of all these Dutch projects into policy, and really making sure that the relevant, let's say, outputs of these projects, let's say, reach policymakers in a form and in a time that is most relevant and most effective. That's what we're trying to do, which is not an easy task, because as we know, let's say science and policy, they occur in really different, let's say, spatial and temporal, let's say, settings, let's say oftentimes not aligned. But so we are really trying to find momentums for making this connection. I was really happy that this year, based on research in my team, that we managed to be part of 3 information papers. One was an information paper, let's say 101 or 1001. I know that Akio students like to take notes, so I'd like to mention them, in which we report of all the publications that have been coming out of these projects so far. Around 30, let's say published, that's articles, let's say chapters and books so far have been coming out of these research projects, which we have also structured along the building blocks that were outlined by René earlier. And I was also very happy to be contributing to this IATCM paper on tourism fees. That was IP 45. On global examples, and on the ASOC paper, that's IP 123, that was already mentioned by Claire, on the regulation of deep field and land-based facilities, that really got some traction in the meeting, let's say last week. I should also say that, let's say next to these IPs, it's really important to also make sure that we have, let's say, events, dedicated events, where we can co-produce relevant output with researchers, with policymakers, and other stakeholders alike. So that's also what we try to focus on and develop, also different communication channels. Now, when it comes to answering this main question, are we a step forward? Then, of course, this depends on what we mean with comprehensive and what we mean with framework. And in many ways, it becomes clear also in the meeting that this is a question that is still very much debated. It was already mentioned, the focus on the framework itself, the form following the form of, let's say function, or whether it's also possible to take a stepwise approach whenever, let's say, states feel that they are reaching a consensus around a particular issue, like what seemed to happen almost around this, let's say Resolution 5 of 2022 around the prohibition of land-based, let's say, facilities for tourism and non-governmental activities. In my view, let's say, whenever we have a chance for something like that, we should not refrain from going ahead with that if the states agree, if the parties agree that this is an element that should definitely be part of this future framework. So let's make use of these momentums as they come along. The same might apply to these issues of fees and monitoring that was also, let's say foregrounded by particular parties. Because it might. What I would like to say, in addition, is that it may be easier to agree on certain issues, let's say like fees or a prohibition of some sorts on activities that are not there yet, right? Which applies to most of these issues. It's more problematic to agree, of course, on issues that are more blurry, right? That are such as the shared use of infrastructure or issues around interdependencies between science and tourism that we see in deep field, let's say activities, for example, or the economic interest of certain countries around tourism, or maybe the mobile character of tourism. That these are more tricky issues to agree on. A final message that I would have is that I think it's really important that we have scientific results in the meeting on the framework discussions. Let's say similar to the kind of work that happens around the emperor penguins, for example. It really brings vital information to the table. It also sometimes creates, or let's say, a sense of urgency in the room that is very much needed also for the tourism framework. I think we have seen that in the last meeting, for example, in the examples mentioned. So in the next couple of years, through these funded projects that I'm part of, we will really try to do so, to bring this information out there, and as I mentioned, in forms that might be useful, and we really look forward to continuing a cooperation with different countries, but also with organizations like IATTO, with ASOC, and YACN on this. So let's also, for the other academics in the room, let's all make sure that this information gets out there if you think that this is really relevant for the framework. And I think also that's really the final point, Bill. I also would like, or I mean, I hope, and we will try also in the Netherlands to make sure that such an approach as we are seeing here in Japan, this trail, this event that we are having these days, that we would be able to continue that in the coming years, including in 2 years when the ATCM is coming to the Netherlands. So with that, I think I would like to close.
Awesome, thank you very much. I've got to admit, when I was with the US delegation there, I was very jealous of the funding and the focus of the Netherlands government with the projects and the development. And I encourage that at least some of the studies that you work on include a study of the process that the Netherlands has done to really keep tourism and transition this tourism conversation into the framework conversation that we're having now. I'm not certain that it would have happened without the sustained leadership and funding that the Netherlands has done. So I congratulate you, the Netherlands, on that whole process and for all the work that you and your team has been doing to move that forward. And Osamu, we want you to finish this off, give us some solutions here, move us forward here. I look forward to your contributions.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Osamu Inagaki, researcher of Polar Cooperation Research Center, Kobe University. I am a researcher of international law on both poles, Arctic and Antarctic. I'm not although I'm not an expert of Antarctic tourism, but I'm very honored to be a part of this distinguished panel. Rather, I'm very nervous. And I'm not a participant of the ATCM, so I do not know about what the discussion going on and the present ATCM, but I am now working on the governance of Antarctic air tourism with Ms. Ursula Mackensen, doctoral student of Wageningen University, Netherlands. Here, the Arctic air tourism refers to Antarctic tourism using aircraft. I and Ursula and also Professor Keith Bastmeyer had an online workshop last September on Arctic air tourism with participation of Machiel and also Lisa. Thank you very much for your participation. And we had also a workshop seminar on Arctic governance of Arctic air tourism in the Polar Symposium held in last October in Nuuk, Greenland. So I would like to briefly share some information and some thoughts out of this exercise. Currently, the vast majority of tourists still go to Antarctic Treaty Area by vessels. However, according to IATTO documents submitted to the ATCM, the number of intercontinental flights and the intracontinental flights for deep field tourism are steadily increasing. It is also reported that air cruise activities are rapidly increasing in Antarctic Peninsula area. This increase of Antarctic air tourism poses environmental and safety concern now. In response to this concern, last year, Norway submitted a proposal to the ATCM to temporarily suspend the authorization of new non-governmental intracontinental air operation in Antarctica until tourism framework is adopted. Although this proposal was not adopted by the ATCM, this proposal indicates the concerns of increasing air tourism is real. Also, last year, there was a U.S. influencer, Mr. Ethan Gore's unauthorized flight from Punta Arenas to Chilean airport in King George Island. Chile attempted to exercise criminal jurisdiction against Ethan Gore, but it finally gave up the criminal charge. As Chile submitted the information paper on this incident this year, I guess there was some discussion on this unauthorized flight in ATCM. Anyway, this incident also poses a concern of increase of unreported flights. Then, how should the prospective comprehensive framework respond to this Antarctic air tourism? Although so far the ATCM has adopted several resolutions on air safety issues, there are not so many ATCMs instruments specifically for regulating the Antarctic air tourism compared with vessel-based tourism. So in my view, there are certain cases in which the ATCM needs to develop new regulations. For example, in order to introduce a general ban of flights as proposed by Norway, or put a cap on the number of flights, ATCM needs to adopt the new regulations. Also, in order to prevent and address unreported flights more effectively, it might be also necessary for the ATCM to introduce new regulations. But at the same time, I think it is also it is important to recall that the Antarctic Treaty and its environmental protocol already contain pretty good general obligations that are applicable to the Antarctic air tourism and non-governmental activity in general. These obligations include a reporting obligation under Article 7, Paragraph 5 of the Antarctic Treaty, and the environmental impact assessment obligations under the protocol, and also monitoring and compliance obligation under the protocol. In particular, the compliance obligation under Article 3, Paragraph 4 of the protocol, environmental protocol, which requires Antarctic activity to be consistent with environmental principles, has pretty good regulatory potential of Antarctic tourism. But it seems to me that this provision has attracted less attention so far. So I think how to make use of these existing obligations and how to strengthen them is also an important perspective in developing a comprehensive framework. In short, in developing a comprehensive framework, on one hand, it is sometimes necessary to create new regulations, but it is also important to make use of existing obligations and strengthen these existing ones. Thank you.
Excellent, and thank you very much. That was super useful here. And we are at that time of the panel where I'm going to ask one question here to the panelists, and then we're going to turn it over to our crowd here. And the question that I'm really curious about here is, tourism, it's been developed. There's environmental protocol that exists. There's some specific tourism resolutions, agreements. But there's also this possibility that René mentioned of a paradigm shift. And I'm curious, what here does this panel here think about paradigm shifts? How much of the old do we keep? How do we move forward here? And with that very broad question, who's going to step up? Oh, yes, good.
Yeah, I can start. It's a very good question, and this idea of paradigm shift has been mentioned several times also by Dutch, let's say, policy makers. What is, I think, really important is that we have to think about what the paradigm is. So if we think about what the protocol says, right? So I would guess that the paradigm is in the protocol, the current, let's say paradigm. And the protocol, let's say, talks about a precautionary approach, right? So if we take that as a starting point, you could wonder whether a paradigm shift is needed or whether what we're doing, let's say having a framework that is forward-looking and that is able to address maybe challenges that might be coming later on that we want to address now when we still can, is very much in line with that. But the question is, of course, that the reality of the practice of policy making over the last decades has very much been one of conditioning, let's say activities, not prohibiting. Very much an issue of, you know, starting activities, developing guidelines, let's say also through the industry, and then getting them codified, which is of course a different, maybe kind of approach to policy making. So it's a question of what we mean with paradigm as such. That would be my.
René.
Thank you for bringing the panel back to the question I asked and no one addressed. And thank you, Machiel, for taking the bait and starting the discussion. And I think that's very helpful in framing this discussion, saying, okay, well, and Phil mentioned that as well, we have the protocol. And the protocol is not that bad. So it was, at least in 1992, considered to be very progressive in terms of environmental protection at a global level and over global commons. Now we have the BBNJ, and one might argue that that goes a bit further in several respects. But we have the protocol, and we have been implementing the protocol and developing the protocol. But the protocol, when it comes to tourism and other non-governmental activities, creates an enabling environment. It's for national competent authorities then to decide this can take place and this we don't want to take place, but then you get the issue of forum shopping. So what I've always understood that parties meant when they're talking about paradigm shift is we have to move to prohibitions, and you mentioned that as well. So perhaps we should close sites, perhaps we should close Antarctica except for the sites that then the ATCM decides is open for tourism, which means that tourism will be concentrated, and the same for activities. I think that is what I have understood by the paradigm shift. And my question is that really necessary in order to come to an effective, comprehensive, and consistent regulatory framework?
Thanks, yes. And I might just observe that the term paradigm shift has come up probably most often with respect to how activities are assessed. And some parties have discomfort or express discomfort with certain types of activity based on their views that some activities are inappropriate or shouldn't occur. And then the current situation is that assessment and judgment about whether an activity may occur or not, or a type of activity may occur or not, is exercised by parties under the guidance of the tools we have, like the protocol's environmental impact assessment framework. So I think this is one of those clear situations where we have heard varied views across the membership or across the consultative parties on that topic, and I think it's one that will play out, and it's a really important discussion. One of the, and this is where I come back to my sort of pragmatic optimist position, is if we have a paradigm shift, then we have to map out how that works in practice. So, for example, if we establish a list of activities that may be permitted to occur, then what are the prospects for the parties who you have the alternate view to add to that list in the future. So there's different implications for the decisions we take in the framework for the sort of future consequences of those decisions, and that's what parties will be looking at when they consider this. But it is, yeah, it's one of those binary situations that we have popping up now in the discussions, and I think it's been underpinning people's views for a long time. Is that question of is it okay if somebody goes and does a marathon, or is it not okay? And different parties have expressed different views about those things. Some parties think that if you assess the environmental impact and the safety implications, then that might be okay, and other parties think that there's some more fundamental value-based reasons why it's not okay. So it's a tricky one and a sticky one, but we'll get there.
Thank you, René, for bringing that back up again, and sorry for I didn't mean to avoid it intentionally, but, and I'm not going to necessarily answer the question directly, because in essence, the tourism operators will support what the framework is decided upon. Obviously, we would like to understand where those, perhaps the closures and those decisions, how they're being made, because again, that brings everybody into the process and helps them feel, connected, have that buy-in, and part of that process. But I did want to part of this, which may or may not be useful, and going back to transparency, something that may be helpful for parties to consider as they look at what they may or may not close, what they may or may not ban. And I'm going to go direct to observations and inspections specifically, because I know a lot of you in this room, you have experience in operational and practical aspects of Antarctica, but sometimes what we find is that those who are having discussions don't necessarily have the full scope of what is happening operationally in the field, on the ground. So they get information from different sources, whether or not those sources have actually been to Antarctica or been with an operator to see how those operations are run, may or may not be the case. So I think that what we bring up in some of our papers and in our discussions is that these observations and inspections are actually really important. And I say observations, and this goes to the what Bill back in his day worked very, very hard on the voluntary observation program for the national competent authorities, but also for the inspections that happen, which also can include Antarctic tourism operators. Back in my day in the field, I was participated in 2 of those off of the vessels I worked on. So this ability for competent authorities, for those at the table, to come into the field and either participate in inspections, to participate in observations, whether it be their own programs. We know Australia, New Zealand, and France have all done inspections this year. They've put in papers on that, and that France and Germany have been participating with IATTO, where they run a kind of a dual observation, their own national authority, as well as an IATTO observation, because our operators, we also have an internal observation system, which Claire and Bill both have been observers on our vessels. And I think that as we're looking at the information and feeding into the process of developing the framework and what may or may not work with regards to if those stronger restrictions are going to be put into place, that understanding what the operators are doing in the field is a key point which may wish to be considered.
Just on the specific points of the marathon, again, this is just a personal preference. I've done 2 marathons, neither on Antarctica. I think it's a horrible idea. But again, that's not necessarily a factual-based process, because from what I understand, if you're just running up and down an airfield that is already existing, then you're not creating any more wear and tear on the environment. But that's just a personal aside here. We have a few minutes left, and that means there's some opportunity here for the audience to participate here. And we're going to go back there. Nope, you. Since you just escaped chairing, now you get to ask the questions here. Then we got, I think, Katie next. Great.
Thank you very much, Antje Neumann from the University of Akureyri, Iceland. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask a question that at least 3 of you in the auditorium in the panel would be have a say on this or an opinion on this. And it relates to the paradigm shift and also to the exclusiveness or inclusiveness that has been discussed in the morning. When we are talking about this, do you think also that the framework discussions for tourism framework couldn't be a first example for opening the discussions, the framework, the scope to be more inclusive? For instance, involving also other participants in the discussions than ATCPs and experts, especially when you talk about, Claire, about the rights of nature of Antarctica. I know there are so many. So who has a say and what are the voices? And not only talking, do we need prohibitions, to be also maybe spanning the framework of the discussion wider, also to discuss no-go alternatives. I mean, this might be quite very broad, but having transparency and openness and also responsibility towards the world or humanity as such, Antarctic should be governed in the interest of humanity. These questions come up. And why not having these discussions and in this forum taking a precedent to having this more open? Thank you.
Panel? Claire, you've been called out.
In terms of opening up this discussion to other folks, I think you're going to find that that's a very difficult task because there are so many domestic issues for the parties that they have to deal with in any kind of framework, because any framework that they adopt needs to be implemented domestically, right? So a lot of times, I think maybe individual representatives might think, oh yeah, this would be a good idea to include in the framework, but they know that it would be very difficult for them to actually do, so they might not be able to support it in their country's legal system. So I mean, I am a big proponent of transparency in the Antarctic Treaty System. I don't think the system is very transparent now, and I think that is to the detriment of the long-term protection of Antarctica. But in terms of this discussion, because it does get so technical, I'm not sure this would be the right one to do. I think even just getting parties to be able to agree to something that is more legally enforceable and comprehensive in terms of regulating tourism would be really huge and really important to do. And I think right now just managing the existing voices is quite a huge task that René has to take on. So again, I want to say I'm not advocating for a lack of transparency. I'm just not sure that this discussion is a great one to add it into because it is so technical. So.
Yes, that's a really good question. It makes me think of one of Australia's positions on this, and that is that at a sort of top philosophical level, we think it's probably appropriate for our citizens to be able to have an experience of Antarctica. Now, that can't happen for everybody, and there's obvious cost and equity barriers to that occurring, but broadly speaking, we do think it's a good thing that people have the opportunity to see Antarctica if it's managed appropriately and safely and very carefully. When it comes to who represents Antarctica's interests, part of what we do as the ATCM and as the parties is we are custodians and stewards of Antarctica for our publics. We try and do that and represent the interests of our publics in Antarctic governance as best we can. When people postulate alternative systems like rights of Antarctica or rights of nature systems, I'm not an expert on these fairly sophisticated legal frameworks or suggestions, but for me it comes back to at some point in any discussion you need a proxy to represent Antarctica's rights. Currently, governments of the world are doing that and representing Antarctica's rights as they are obligated to do under the protocol. And so I think that's where we stand currently. So in terms of additional participants in the discussions, I think Claire makes some good points. It's pretty complicated already, and we hope that we're not just bringing, very specific national considerations to these discussions. I think most participants are showing and demonstrating that they have the broader collective interest, because that's the only way we're ever going to get to consensus, is to have flexibility and a view to all of the different objectives and interests.
Yes, thanks for the question and the responses so far. I think there might be opportunities for this maybe outside of the formal discussion. So I'm again thinking of maybe this is a great research, let's say project, right? Or it's a really interesting project for public engagement around Antarctic policy making, and then maybe particularly. What comes to mind first is, what do school children say about the regulation of tourism in the Antarctic, right? Perhaps sometimes this is, as next generation, they have to live with the policies we are developing now. And maybe this also sometimes it creates a very interesting impulse when also for policymakers themselves when they realize what the next generations would say. With regard to the comment you made, Phil, about that it would be good if all Australians would be visiting Antarctica, or most, or something like that.
Not all, almost, I don't think.
Yeah. So there's in the literature a lot of discussion around the kind of the transformative, let's say character or capacity of Antarctic travel, and this is also promoted. So the ambassadorship model. Yes. What I sometimes think about is that when we think too much about this, then it's almost as if Antarctica should have a utility, right, for us. That it's kind of that we think too much along the lines of what can we use Antarctica for, right? And I sometimes think like Antarctica doesn't need to do anything for us, right? And in a way, Antarctica is best served if not too many of us are actually going there. So that's why also maybe the framework is so important, and also maybe with regard to the paradigm shift that we started with earlier. Let's activities are moving south. New sites are being used every year. New activities are taking place every year. Let's say, and this will continue if we do not, let's say, draw some lines somewhere. And yeah.
Great, thank you very much. We just have a few minutes left. I know we got Katie here, so quick question, quick answers, please.
All right, I'll be quick. So, team, over the last 2 weeks, we've had a few mentions on the floor of the ATCM that it's tourism and non-government activities. I'm curious to get your thoughts as to how we differentiate the two. Is there a clear line? And feel free to answer this from an operational or procedural perspective, but what are the opportunities but also the challenges of seeking to address tourism or manage tourism and non-governmental activities in the same forum?
She mentioned procedure there, Renee. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want me to talk? Because I won't get into any political trouble, like a party might. Well, in answer to your question, yes, I think that is a tricky subject. I mean, as you refer, there was a long debate about whether we say tourism and other non-governmental activities, and or not, whether you just say tourism and non-governmental activities, because. And the reason for that distinction is that sometimes there isn't a clear line between a governmental activity and tourism. So, you know, if a tourism operator is using facilities at a research station to carry out some of their operations, like a runway or something like that, is that a problem? Is that encroaching upon the primary function of those stations, which is science? Is that something that parties generally are okay with, or something that some of them are not okay with? And there's a very wide range of perspectives on that. So I think what is tricky in the context of the framework is that there is a desire on the part of some to prevent tourism from growing because national operators are encouraging it to help, maybe to help support the costs of carrying out research, which is very expensive. But then you get into a very tricky situation where you're telling parties what they can or can't do in the future, and a lot of them are going to have a problem with that. So it raises a lot of questions that are very delicate. It's very easy. The example in the ASOC paper that got everybody all excited was outside of any government. So it's really easy for parties to converge on that and say, no, we don't want a private organization doing this. But I think it is going to be a really difficult question. And it may not be one that can be answered because there is such a wide divergence of opinion. But as from my non-governmental perspective, I wish they would address it, because it is complicated and it is something that you want to have clear guidance on, so that different parties, so again, that there is consistency. You don't want a couple of parties really encouraging or doing a whole bunch of things that other parties are banning, because then again, it brings up all these issues of forum shopping and how is tourism as a whole developing, and is it going in a direction that generally that folks want? So I don't know if that answers your question, but just to say that I think it's an extremely sensitive question, and one that might not be able to get consensus. So.
Great, and with that, I want to say thank you very much to the panel, very much thank you to the audience here. Our next step, I understand, is a coffee break, but before we get to that, thank you very much.